Join us for a 1,600-mile fishing and exploration road trip out of Jacksonville, Florida, along the beautiful Natchez Trace Parkway. The parkway stretches 444 miles from Nashville, Tennessee to Natchez, Mississippi. Plus, along the way, we'll be taking some additional stops. During this 3-week trip, we'll be camping. And our camper comes with all the comforts of home with a king-size bed and air conditioning. Plus, I'm bringing a 12-foot foldable boat with a 6-horsepower engine, so I'll be able to easily explore all the lakes and rivers that I'll be coming across. On this trip, I brought a couple of swimsuits and Columbia shirts, a pair of Crocs, and more importantly, 5 tackle bags and some other fishing paraphernalia. Our first stop on this trip was at DeSoto State Park in northeastern Alabama. A must-see in this area is DeSoto Falls. I launched my boat right at the dam, but I really didn't need it. I was able to catch plenty of panfish by just standing on the bank next to the dam, using my fly rod and a Prince nymph. From the dam, we followed this peaceful tributary of the little river and enjoyed the rhododendron and mountain laurels that were in full bloom. Another spot you want to explore when you're near DeSoto State Park is Little River Canyon National Preserve. The canyon has some beautiful areas to see, and the fishing is pretty good too. There are several spots along the canyon to park a vehicle and walk down to the river, like this one at Everhart Point, which is about a 3/4 of a mile path. Just be ready for some steep grades as you're walking down. Once you reach the bottom, you'll be rewarded with some great water to fish. What the fish lack in size, they make up in quantity. This is a red-eye or shoal bass, which is one of the more sought-after species in the Little River. Back at DeSoto State Park, there were some great access areas to the Little River. The best one I found was up by the lodge. It was an enjoyable path that didn't have too steep of a grade and also had lots of mountain laurel and rhododendron along the way to enjoy. Once on this section of the Little River, there were lots of interesting fish-holding habitats to explore. I started out the morning with a popper, but the fish kept hitting at it and missing. I switched to a nymph and it was game on. The first fish of the morning was a small panfish. During the morning, the action was very steady with small panfish and bass. The best part, though, was having this beautiful, relaxing stream all to myself. This is not one of my better releases, but this fish was motivated to get back to his friends. For a change of pace, we took a side trip to Scottsboro, Alabama, which is famous for the unclaimed airline baggage store. For me, the best place to spend time in Scottsboro was at the Payne Drug Store. It has an old-timey lunch counter and soda fountain, and be sure and get a milkshake. A short drive from Scottsboro is Cathedral Cavern State Park. Here you'll find over 3,500 feet of wheelchair-accessible paths. The whole cave actually extends for over 2 miles. The cave is best known for its frozen stone waterfalls and stalagmite forest. The cracks in these stalactites were caused by an earthquake. After breaking camp at DeSoto State Park, we left for Joe Wheeler State Park. This location was one of my favorites of the trip because of the great fishing and how close it was to the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. They had everything here, from an A-12 ox cart, the predecessor of the world's fastest plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, the space shuttle, the Saturn V5 rocket that took man to the moon, the lunar rover, and a moon rock thrown in for good measure. As I said earlier, Joe Wheeler Lake was one of my favorite places for fishing. The secret to success here at Joe Wheeler was finding a rocky shoreline that led into deep water. Here's a nice little smallmouth that went for my crankbait. I love the blue tail on this hybrid, which is a cross between a white bass and a striped bass. You can tell it's a hybrid because the lateral black lines are broken. A true striper has solid black lines. This was my first freshwater drum, and plenty of largemouth bass to go around too. It was time once again to break camp and head west and finally get on the Natchez Trace Parkway. We picked up the parkway right as it crossed the Tennessee River into Alabama, right at Colbert's Ferry. The 444-mile Natchez Trace Parkway is a national park. The trace began as animal trails that were followed by the first Paleo Indians that first inhabited North America. Later on, these same trails became trading routes for the Indians, and then later on the white settlers used the trace as a road to their new homesteads and for trade. Here at Colbert's Ferry, an industrious Chickasaw chief by the name of George Colbert opened up a stand, which was a roadhouse to offer travelers a place to rest and also get a good meal. George Colbert also ran the ferry, and one time he charged Andrew Jackson $75,000 to bring his troops across the Tennessee River after the Battle of New Orleans in 1812. A short drive to the south from Colbert's Ferry is Bear Creek Mound. The mound was built by hand around 900 AD. Atop the mound sat a wooden structure that was used for religious ceremonies. Next to the mound is Bear Creek, and what you're looking at is the original Muscle Shoals. Not the town where all the great music comes from, but basically a shallow bank next to the creek where you'll find lots of mussels. After seeing Bear Creek, I needed to get back on the water, so we headed over to J.P. Coleman State Park, which is on the Pickwick Lake section of the Tennessee River. This lake was very scenic and had some great beaches too. One of my favorite sights on the lake was Yellow Creek Waterfall. And the other thing I loved about this area, the fish were always hungry. Well, it was time again to get back on the trace and head south to Jackson, Mississippi. Our first stop was at Farr Mounds. Over an area of 90 acres, there are 8 burial mounds that were in use from about 1 to 200 AD. Farr Mounds was also a major trading area for all the Indians in the southeast and stretching as far north as the shores of Lake Ontario. Until earlier this year, I didn't even know that the Natchez Trace existed until my wife suggested going there for our vacation. There's something for everybody along the trace. It's kind of like Highway 66 meeting the Blue Ridge Parkway. You never know what's going to be around the next corner. In Jackson, Mississippi, we stayed at Lafleurs Bluffs State Park. The lake had plenty of gars in it, but we didn't spend too much time chasing them because there was so much to see in the area. Directly across from the state park was the Mississippi Agriculture and Agricultural Aviation Museum. Outside was a collection of historic buildings that made up a typical Mississippi small town, including a general store and a doctor's office. Behind the doctor's office was a small medicinal garden that included such plants as echinacea. And just like today, it appears that patients had to wait a long time for their appointments. Inside was a large collection that traced the history of agriculture in Mississippi, and the part I liked the best was the history of aviation in agriculture. About an hour outside of Jackson is Vicksburg National Military Park. The siege of Vicksburg was a decisive battle in the Civil War. Vicksburg is the key, said President Abraham Lincoln to General Ulysses S. Grant and Secretary of War Edward Stanton, and he went further to say, "The war can never be brought to an end until that key is in our pocket." The siege of Vicksburg lasted 47 days, and the residents that stayed behind had to dig cave-like bunkers to survive the onslaught of Union artillery. The city of Vicksburg sat at a strategic point on the Mississippi River, and because of this, the U.S. Navy's ironclad warships played a decisive role in the Union's victory at Vicksburg. Driving back from Vicksburg, we stopped at the Mississippi Petrified Forest. Here you can enjoy a 15-minute walk through the Petrified Forest and then take in the Mineral and Fossil Museum, including this very unique specimen. Once again, it's time to break camp and enjoy the sights as we head south on the Natchez Parkway. When we did this trip in mid-May to early June, there were gorgeous displays of flowers all along the trace. Near Natchez, just off the parkway, is Emerald Mound, a must-see historic site. The mound covers roughly 8 acres, and construction was begun in 1350 and continued in stages over the next 300 years. This is the second largest temple mound in the U.S. and was built by the Mississippian ancestors of the Natchez Indians. Unlike dome-shaped mounds constructed only for burials, Emerald Mound supported temples, ceremonial structures, and burials of a complex society's civic and religious leaders. And we finally have arrived at the namesake of the trail that we've been on for the last several weeks, the city of Natchez. Natchez sits prominently on a high bluff overlooking the Mississippi River. This notorious section of Natchez is called Under the Hill and is where riverboat crews and gamblers would hang out. In the days before steam power, the crews would stay a few days and drink and gamble, and then they would get on the Natchez Trace and walk their way north to wherever their homes were. When steamboats were invented, Natchez had its heyday. It became a major port, shipping goods both up and down the Mississippi River. It was during this time that many of the antebellum homes that Natchez is famous for were built. Once the railroad arrived, the port was devastated, and so was the local economy. While visiting Natchez, we stayed at Natchez State Park. I love this location because of its beautiful lake, which holds the record for the largest bass ever caught in Mississippi. You'll find plenty of fish-holding structure in this lake with all the submerged timber. Plus, there's plenty of deep water to give the fish a cool water refuge during the heat of the summer. The best producing bait for me was a crankbait. They worked well both on bass and panfish. And if you want to take it easy and just dunk a worm, that'll catch them too. Our next camp was at Little Black Creek near Lumberton, Mississippi. From here we drove into New Orleans for the day. We enjoyed some beignets and some good Creole cuisine. One of my favorite stops for the day was at James H. Cohen & Sons. They've been at the same location for 120 years, and going through their shop is like walking through history. Well, after a fun day in New Orleans, it was time to go back to the campsite and try out a little fishing. I'm happy to report that the fish missed us, and they were very hungry. Crankbaits and worms were the baits of choice. As the setting sun paints its colors in the sky, it's time to thank all of my subscribers for watching, and if you haven't joined my channel yet, be sure to do so now so you don't miss another adventure.